Distinguished speakers and guests, welcome to this year's last Blue Circle event. I warmly thank you all for being here today. We have striven to ensure that this evening is worth your while. Before I go any further, let me run a quick 1-minuter which summarizes who we are and what our journey has been in the last 1 year.
It is said the true measure of success is profession, position, home, and a circle of friends that one desires. The last is often the last to come by. One yearns for the company of thinking minds and fine people. People who possess traits of nobility and royalty. Royal in merit, but not in means. A circle, not just of the well-heeled, but more of reliable and resourceful people. A circle of the blue-blooded. This is the Blue Circle.
So, along with creating such a community of fine leaders who are a reliable support system for each other, our objective is to adapt them to the VUCA world of today and make them future ready. And to stay tuned to the changes taking across geographies, we're also in the process of tying up with such international platforms such as Hong Kong, Indonesia, and Singapore-based Asia CEO Club and the like. Moving further on this theme, on preparing our members for the future, we have specially invited Mr. David Wood, Chairman of London Futurist, to be with us today. Thank you very much for joining us and taking the pains for being here today. The other well-known speaker for the evening is Mr. Pawan Chaudhary. We have requested him to moderate the session. Thank you very much, sir, for being here today. I now request Mr. Wood and Mr. Chaudhary to please come on stage. Sorry. Round of applause, please. Let's see. Mr. Wood is one of the pioneers of the smartphone industry and a renowned futurist commentator. He has spent 25 years envisioning, architecting, designing, and implementing smartphone mobile devices. David co-founded Symbian, the world's first successful smartphone operating system, which was used in over 500 million smartphones between 2001 and 2012. Later, he headed technology planning for Accenture Mobility and mobility innovation for dramatically better healthcare. He now chairs the London Futurists, a 7,000-strong futurist community, and sits on the board of Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies in the UK. His book, Smartphone and Beyond, Lessons from the Remarkable Rise and Fall of Symbian, has been described as one of the most candid and revealing books a technology executive has ever written. He also holds a triple first-class mathematics degree and doctorate in the philosophy of science, both from Cambridge, UK. He has also received an honorary doctorate in science from the University of Westminster in recognition of his services to the smartphone industry and is considered as one of the 100 most influential people in technology world over. Mr. Chaudhary is the MD of French multinational Vigon India, Trustee Lal Bahadur Shastri Memorial Trust, Chairman, Medical Technology Association of India, Independent Director, TransAsia Biomedicals, and other prominent organizations. He is consulted by many on business and life. He is a public intellectual and the author of critically acclaimed bestsellers, How a Good Person Can Really Win, which was earlier published as When Your Sinking Become a Submarine, a trilogy of wisdom on Chanakya, Confucius, and Kabir, Machiavelli for Moral People, and the RX Factor, a seminal work in healthcare marketing. Mr. Chaudhary has also co-authored path-breaking books with Mr. Anil Shastri and Dr. Kiran Bedi. He also hosts a TV program, Hum Aise Kyun Hain, has written columns for Times of India and Financial Chronicle. Before I hand over the mic to Mr. Chaudhary to start the session, I would like to thank our main sponsors. I'd like to thank British Airways for flying in Mr. Wood. I thank Bloomberg Quint as our media partner, Lopa Mudra Creative as our main design partner, Grover Zampa for the fine wine, and the Leela Gurgaon for their continued support. Please note that we shall have time for Q&A at the end of the session. I now hand the mic over to Mr. Chaudhary to please take the session forward. Thank you, sir.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out of your offices on a Friday afternoon, which is not very difficult, but I really admire the numbers and the timing which you have followed. Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for...
Well, not Friday, is it?
Come again?
I don't think it's Friday.
It's not? Oh, sorry about it.
You're living in the future already.
Already. I'm really sorry about it. I thought it was a Friday. So there I go. Okay. So welcome, David, and thank you for finding time to be with us. I suggest you start the session, and then we'll go forward as we...
Fantastic. So I'm very glad to be here in such a distinguished audience. And the topic I'm going to address is, let's move some of these out of the way. And let's have the slides on the screen, if I may. The topic is predicting 2025. Now, did anybody come here hoping I would do predicting 2019? Some executives, they want as much help as possible for the next quarter or 2 quarters or 3 quarters. But what I'm going to try and convince you is actually it's important, but also useful to have a broader perspective, especially seeing all the changes, the major changes that are likely to be taking place over that next 3, 5, 7-year period. I'm going to draw my remarks based in part on my experiences in the mobile computing and smartphone space, Symbian and beyond, and in part based on my 10 years of chairing more than 200 public meetings in which people from all different perspectives discussed and argued and reasoned about scenarios for the future. By the way, what is a futurist? Sometimes people introduce me saying, here's the man with the crystal ball. He will tell us what will happen. I have to say, I have no such crystal ball. I can't, unfortunately, tell you for sure what will happen. I think you realize that. In any case, it's more intelligent to come with good questions than with good answers. And my goal is that I'll plant some ideas, some questions in your mind, and that over the next weeks and months, the same questions will be going around your mind as you look at trends, if you look at indications about the future, and they will help you to plan the present better. In fact, they will help you to manage your businesses and your activities in 2019 better, because you'll have a better appreciation of what might be happening between now and 2025. I will also give you some tools, such as trend analysis. And when I say trend analysis, I'm not just talking about linear trends. I'm talking about these exponential, disruptive trends, the ones that go through a period of slow, disappointing underperformance before they finally break through with this, oh my goodness, what happened there? We didn't see this coming, did we? Why didn't anybody tell us about that? Trend analysis is sort of the beginning of futurism. More interesting is when we do a scenario analysis, which is when we combine several trends together, including perhaps some linear trends, as well as the exponential trends, including changes in your company DNA, perhaps, and then you figure out what kind of future might that be. So the task of a futurist is to help people envision these scenarios and also evaluate them. Evaluate them in the sense of, is this credible? Might this happen? Evaluate them from the sense of, is this desirable? Would we like it to happen? And then evaluate them from the point of view of action. What can we do now to increase the chances of the desirable scenarios happening and to decrease the chances of the undesirable scenarios? So that's futurism in a nutshell. And I'm going to start my exploration by imagining we're not here today in this amazing city of Gurugram, anticipating, 7 years into the future of business? Just as a comparison, imagine we're in a different city. New York, when? A few years ago, imagining 7 years into the future of a particular industry, the newspaper industry. So just as an experiment, so we can get some idea of what disruptive change looks like. So in 2011, if you were advising the newspaper industry, you would look at data like this. This is the trends in the lifeblood of the newspaper industry, the advertising revenues. And you can see there's some ups and downs. But even adjusted for inflation, one trend is clear. It's on the whole up and up and up. So if you were in the newspaper industry in 2004, you'd be feeling pretty pleased with yourselves, pretty confident, despite the occasional upturns and downturns. Then you might notice what we futurists call a weak signal. There's something new happening, digital, which means that some advertisers are asking you to put their adverts not on your print pages, but on your digital web pages. You can see that little increment in analysis there. So that's the trends. What would you predict for the future of the newspaper industry? Continuing going from strength to strength? This is real data, by the way, and some of my later graphs are conceptualized or generalized, but this is real data. You know what happened next to the advertising revenues of the newspapers? Fell off a cliff. Why? What caused that downturn? Did people stop spending money on advertising? Or did they find somewhere more effective to put their advertising dollars? They increasingly would advertise on eBay and Craigslist, but most of all on Google and eventually Facebook. And that difference in newspaper advertising revenue is almost equal to the revenues of Google and Facebook. But if you were to go back to 2004 and tell the newspaper executives, the internet is going to change your business, many of them would say, the internet? That's old news. We've heard about the internet for a long time. The internet was already, by some counts, what? It was created in 1969, the first two times a computer would talk to each other on what we later called the internet. And in terms of a friendly way to access the internet, the World Wide Web, that was also old news. The World Wide Web had been quite popular since the 1990s. So if you go forward to 2004 and tell these executives, you know, a big disruption is coming, they wouldn't be that keen to believe you, but there it was. These disruptions sometimes take a long time coming before they become really dramatic. Here's the general picture. Disruption means that one industry, one company seems to be doing very well, and then there's an impact and a transformation by something outside of its normal thinking. We can call it an elephant, which, if the company's not careful, will lead it to be a fraction of its former self. Of course, we still have newspapers today, and many newspapers are doing reasonably well, but many, many others have gone out of business or are just surviving on a shoestring. And that brings me to my first kind of general advice, which is that organizations that want to succeed in the long term need to split their focus across three perspectives. Most good companies are very good at this first perspective, keeping the balls in the air, operational excellence, financial management, personnel management, budgeting. Maybe 75% of senior management time should be on this. Then there is some focus on the future, but usually it's the foreseeable incremental future. Usually it's people thinking, I've got a product, I'd like to sell that product to more customers. Can I find more customers for my product? Can I find a way to produce my product more cheaply? Can I add a few more bells and whistles and features to it? And perhaps 20% of senior management time should be on that. But where great companies often stumble is not the foreseeable future, but the surprising, game-changing future. When there's something there which you may not notice if you're not looking for it. That elephant might blend into its background if you're not looking for it. But if you don't see it, it could charge at you and kill you. If you do see it in time, however, if you learn how to get on its back and ride it, it could be the source for major new competitive advantage for you. So at least 5% of senior management time should be on exploring the possible elephants, the game changers. And if you do it right, then this won't be your fate. Rather, it'll be more like this. When this disruption happens, it will still change you fundamentally, but you will be able to go forwards. Not the same kind of company or the same industry as before, but as a combination of your old DNA, your old products, and new products. And the difference between these two setups, the trampled scenario and we can call it the judo scenario, it's two things. First of all, you need the foresight to see clearly the elephant's coming. And secondly, you need the strength and agility to turn that elephant around and be a force to magnify and assist your company. So there we have it, the two basic disciplines of futurism, the foresight and the agility, which I'll say more about. That's example one. I want to look at a second example. This is from my own history. So if I go back 20-something years, I didn't have Futurist on my business card. I had software architect on my business card. I worked for this British company called Symbian, and we were doing quite well selling these handheld computers called personal organizers, or PDAs, personal digital assistants. And we sold in due course 1 million of these Series 3 devices. And what we were doing then, 20-something years ago, we were doing the three things that I said all good companies should do. We were doing the present. We were making sure we could manufacture these devices and do some regional language variants. Then we said, let's do the incremental improvements. And we did a big incremental improvement. We imagined and designed this Series 5 version, which had a better screen, a better operating system, new hardware, lots of better apps. And I still carry along with me my Series 5 MX to this day, 19 years old now. It was a step up. It was the second of these three dimensions. But at the same time, we managed to be aware that an elephant was coming our way, that our comfortable, cozy world of handheld computing was about to be disrupted by a much bigger force than we were in our company. And eventually we drew this picture. You can see here, this is from June 1998, just over 20 years ago, in which we saw our own world, our trend that we knew and loved, computers becoming smaller and more mobile, would be impacted by this huge beast of the mobile phone industry that started off with simple feature phones which didn't have any features, but they had an intention to get into what they started calling smartphones and communicators. And we said, what are we going to do about this elephant? Are we going to ignore it? Are we going to pretend it doesn't exist? Are we going to do our own job very well? Are we going to fight it? And eventually we decided, we're going to change our DNA. So science spun out of itself a subsidiary called Symbian, which took the operating system, defocused the work on communicators, focused instead on making it suitable for smartphones. And we patiently built a platform for collaboration, Epoch, later renamed by marketing wizards as Symbian OS, and to enable a positive feedback cycle so that the engineers and app developers from this mobile phone industry could take advantage of what we'd done and we could build this. And if I look back as an exercise in futurism, this wasn't a bad piece of foresight. We imagined that one day everybody would be using smartphones. We called them wireless information devices. That name didn't stick. We imagined they would all have aerials sticking out of the top. Well, that wasn't true after a while. We didn't imagine that they would use fingers. We had pens. So there were lots we didn't quite foresee, but we did get it right that these devices would be increasingly dominant, and we needed to make them open and programmable. I'll briefly talk through some of the facts and figures, not because there's any test on the facts and figures, but because they illustrate a pattern. We thought initially that we would be profitable in about 3 years. We took funding from the big three mobile phone companies of the time, the big three companies, Motorola, Ericsson, and Nokia, and they valued us as £100 million. Funny thing happened on the way to profitability. It took a lot longer than we thought. There were lots of difficulties en route, like the dot-com crash and a few other things. We needed to go back several times for more funding, more investment, but eventually, after 8 years, we finally were profitable, very profitable. We had sold 100 million of these devices, many more than we ever sold of the old communicators. And then in another 18 months, we had sold another 100 million. So the first took 96 months, the next took less than 96 weeks. There's the pattern, the slow, disappointing phase followed by the rapid acceleration. And within another 3 years, we had sold another 300 million. And if the story would stop there, I ought to be quite pleased and proud because software written by my teams were present on 500 million, 500 million smartphones. But by this time, of course, another elephant had come into the picture. Not the elephant of the mobile phone industry, an elephant from Silicon Valley. And they, Apple's iOS and Google's Android, were by this time on the high-profile, high-profit smartphones, and we were left behind increasingly by smarter, faster, more nimble, more effective companies. Even though we'd looked at Silicon Valley for a while, we didn't think they were very serious. They didn't seem to understand phones until they did. We weren't the only ones who got left behind then. If you go back 12 years, if I ask you what phones you had 12 years ago, those of you who were old enough to have phones 12 years ago, you might have had a BlackBerry in your pocket. Excellent device, really wonderful, secure communications. You might have had a Palm Pilot, another lovely device with super focus on usability, or Motorola, or Nokia, or indeed running software from my company, Symbian. 12 years ago, all of these companies were on top of the world. Since then, they've all become fractions of their former selves. Giants left behind by disruption, stuck in various kinds of inertia. Here's the diagram. There's the first wave of smartphones, Motorola, Nokia, BlackBerry, RIM. It took us a long time, as I said, to displace the feature phones. It was slow before it was fast. And then in turn, it took quite a while for Android and Apple to overtake us. Nowadays, people think the iPhone came out of nowhere and was successful straight away. In reality, Steve Jobs had a disastrous music phone and joint project with Motorola before that history has more or less forgotten, the Rocker. Android took 7 years from its product conception in 2003 until it was selling in 2010, 10 million units a year. So, history shows that the future arrives in waves, and the waves often start slow and disappointing before becoming fast and furious. The second thing, this second lesson I take away from this picture is increasingly software is dominant in these devices. As in the words of leading venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, software is eating the world. Whatever your business is, unless you're on top of software, you're likely to be left behind by your competitors who understand software more. The first set of phones had relatively little software. You might have played Snake on one of these phones, perhaps. The next set, software was pretty important because there were mini computers in their own right. The next set, from about 2010 onwards, there's supercomputers. There's more processing power on a modern smartphone than all the computers used by NASA to navigate Apollo 11 to the moon and back. So no wonder there was very powerful and sophisticated software needed. More generally, my message is the latest technology is increasingly going to eat the world. And unless you're on top of the latest technology, you're likely to be the victim of an elephant rampaging over your business. We can see that briefly if we look at the data on the most valuable companies measured by the share price valuation over the last 20 years. For most of that time, the most valued companies were a mix of oil companies like Exxon, PetroChina, also financial companies like Citibank or ICBC, occasional manufacturing companies, with a few high-tech companies appearing occasionally. But for the last 3 years, the most highly valued companies have all been high-tech companies that are very focused on software and increasingly focused on AI. And even since then, the valuation of most of these companies has shot up many more times. This shows Apple at $582 billion. Today it's like $800 billion, but recently it was more than $1 trillion. Technology is eating the world. In particular, I'm going to argue in the remainder of my session that there's various technologies from the fourth industrial revolution, which is just getting going, are going to transform the world more thoroughly and more fundamentally than even the disruptions of the past. And one of these technologies is the next wave of AI. I'm not talking about the good old-fashioned AI, the expert systems in which people had to code individually all the rules for how a system would draw its conclusions, software which was significant commercially from the 1970s onwards. I'm talking about the new wave of AI, so-called deep learning or neural networks, which people thought about for a long time. Even back in the 1950s, people like John von Neumann and Alan Turing, both pioneers of computing, speculated that a better way to do AI would be this kind of copying the brain's neural networks. But for a long time, it seemed this was impossible. And then, from about 2012, suddenly this world has changed. Suddenly, deep learning and neural networks has been able to do things much more successfully. So if you want to teach computers to translate from one human language to another, for example, from English into Russian, in the old days, you'd have to teach it all the rules of Russian language individually, one by one, all the declensions, all the conjugations. Today, you just say, here's the English version of Harry Potter, here's the Russian version of Harry Potter, and other good translations, and it works out by itself, by and large, how to do translations by just picking up the patterns. Increasingly, from 2012 onwards, computers were much better than before at making sense out of vision, image recognition. In 2012, the software looked at this picture and said, I know what's going on here. This is a group of young people playing a game of Frisbee. And the software engineer supervising this almost fell off his seat in surprise at how accurate the description that was. Previously, all you would have heard is that, well, there's some green there might be some grass. That's about as most that the software could come up with. You shouldn't be impressed by a single anecdote like that, but what may impress you more is data of something that happens every year. It's a competition. It's called the Large-Scale Visual Recognition Challenge, in which software teams are given huge numbers of pictures, and they're asked for each of them to pick from a series of 5 captions, which is the most accurate. And you can see here the improvement year by year from an error rate of about 28% until more recently below 2.5%. You can see the surge there in 2012, which is the first time a team from a university in Canada, led by Jeff Hinton, sometimes called the godfather of deep learning, how they applied this deep learning and were more successful than anybody had expected. They were able to take advantage of new processors called graphics processing units. They did a few modifications to the algorithms, and from that time on, everybody used this new system, and we're now up at the level where, for many purposes, computers are better than humans in making sense of pictures. They're at superhuman capacity. Because even we humans make mistakes sometimes when we see pictures. For example, if I show you these pictures of road signs, if you're in a hurry, can you always be sure what's in the pictures? Turns out that computers are now better than humans in making sense of traffic signs. Here's a test last year from, I think, Germany. The humans in this test, better than me. I don't think I would just have an error of 1%, but that's what the humans did, and the neural networks were twice as good. Even more interesting, they were 6 times better than the old-fashioned means. So this is software that taught itself by looking at many previous photographs and just figured out what it meant for a sign to say this is uneven road or speed limits. And this can be applied now in more and more fields. If you're in the medical field, you know that it takes a long time to scan and make sense of an image like this. This is lymph node biopsy. Does this contain cancer or not? Google have helpfully filled this in here. This one does contain a tumor. It also contains something called a macrophage, which you shouldn't flag up as tumorous. That would be a false positive. Now, these scans are typically huge, 100,000 pixels by 100,000 pixels. It can take an expert human pathologist a long time to look at one of them. In one test, the poor human had to look at 30 slides to figure out which of them were indications of cancer or not. And over that long period, he got most of them right, but still a lot of them wrong. AI was asked to do the same task. It's not perfect yet, but it's better than the humans. So increasingly, the humans can now do this job better with the help of AI, which is able to look at many, many more pictures than the humans ever could and learn from it. And deep learning is able to do this not just with images, it's able to do it with written documents. Not all written documents yet, but written documents of certain regular types, such as legal documents. Some of your best friends are probably lawyers. Well, in this test, a company called LawGeekX compared their AI system, trained on looking at many previous NDAs, and it was put into competition with a bunch of human lawyers. In fact, lawyers who in most cases had decades worth of experience. And each of them were tested on a series of 5 real-world NDAs, that's non-disclosure agreements, and they were asked to review them and say, should the client sign these, or should they query them in case there's some clause in there which might give away too many rights to the company that owns the NDA? So the documents didn't look that large, but of course legal documents have lots of text in them. Experts who studied them said that in these clauses there were probably 30 issues that a good lawyer should notice and ask you to query before you put your signature to this and sign away too much of your own intellectual property. So how did the two competitors do in this test? The lawyers got most of it right, but they missed 15% of the clauses on average. The AI was about 3 times as good. The lawyers took on average to read these 5 pages and evaluate them 92 minutes. They were doing it quite carefully. They knew their reputation was on the line. How long do you think it took the deep learning AI to do the same thing? Less than 92 minutes? 5 minutes? 26 seconds. So now, of course, we haven't put lawyers out of business yet. There are many things the lawyers can do that the AI can't do, but it's changing more and more and more. Let's look at another thing that humans are good at today, which is looking at each other's face and knowing how we're feeling. But AIs are able to do this increasingly too in the field known as affective computing. Because after all, how do we know what the woman in the red dress is feeling? When we're sort of running through patterns in our mind, we say, yeah, she looks joyful. The man in the middle looks surprised. The one in the end looks angry. So we draw on our emotional intelligence to do this. But software can learn it as well, can pick these ones out as well. The woman on the left is disgusted. The one in the middle is fearful, and the man is sad. But increasingly affective computing or computing with artificial emotional intelligence is able to look at your face, as in this woman's company, Rana Al-Kalioubi. Many of these companies in this space, interestingly, are headed up by women. Rana Al-Kalioubi is an Egyptian-American, and she imagines a future not too far away when more of computing devices have got a chip in them, a bit like the GPS chip that knows location, but this chip will be telling the software about the emotions and adjusting to it. Some of this is already happening. There are artificial toys, artificial seals, which are doing quite impressive work with people with dementia, giving them a sense of emotional attachment that they didn't have before, in some cases making the people with dementia start speaking after not having spoken for many months or even years. This Japanese newspaper headline probably exaggerates things a bit. Robots in Japan now have emotions, but it is true that these robots can increasingly read our emotions. They can tell the difference between a fake smile and a genuine smile. They can pick up micro emotions on the face, just quick flickers that you now try to suppress, but the AI can spot it. And they can even tell the difference in our tone of voice when we're stressed. Either we're stressed out because we're calling an insurance company and we're exaggerating the extent of our losses, and we're stressed out because we're telling a lie, or we're stressed out just because we're shocked at having been robbed. How do you tell the difference? Well, emotionally intelligent software can increasingly do that. Software can increasingly do caring and compassionate roles. It's not there yet, but it's on the way. Software can increasingly do creative work. This is software by David Cope, which studies music in the style of Bach and is able to generate new music in the style of Bach. And when people hear it, without knowing where it comes from, they often say it's wonderful, it touched their innermost being. If you tell them it was written by a robot, they sometimes backtrack and say, I didn't like it that much really, it was a bit clunky. But if you do an objective test, the so-called Turing test, if you give them a music written by a computer and music written by a human, or actually music written by the real Bach, but not so well known, they will often pick out the music by the AI as being the best of the bunch. We're moving forwards. That's still sort of the past. What I want to tell you more about is the future, not the current wave of deep learning and neural networks, but the next wave of AI. And I can't tell you when that's going to be, but I'm fairly sure there's going to be more intense progress in AI well before 2025. Why? It's because of the motivations people have to improve AI. When I was young, the motivation to research AI was pure knowledge or scientific experiments. Now, AI, as we saw, is big, big, big money. The most valuable companies in the world are all AI companies, and the ones who get the lead on the next wave of AI will probably be even more significant. And this applies in almost every industry. If you're using AI to help you trade stocks and shares, if you do that smarter with AI, you can make more money. If you're doing games, if you're writing games for the gaming industry, which in some ways is even bigger than Hollywood, many characters inside that are virtual. If you give them better AI, maybe your games will sell better, make you even more money. Customer support, if you can have better chatbots. Current chatbots are fairly dumb, and the users fairly quickly get tired of them and want to talk to a real human. Imagine if the chatbots could do that much longer and answer fuller. How much more money would that save you? How much more satisfied would the customers be? Interaction design, healthcare research, new creative directions in music, as I was just talking about. This morning I saw a report from Google's DeepMind subsidiary in London. They had used AI, they called it AlphaFold, to predict some behavior of big chemicals called proteins more accurately than before. It's not just the good guys who stand to make money if they have better AI. There is a small community of people, criminals, who love to write malware, make money out of malware, and if they have more intelligent malware, they're going to make more money. And there's another community called the security researchers who try to write more sophisticated detection systems. So there's an arms race going on there between the malware writers and the anti-malware software. And there's lots of improvements as a result. It's the same also for real weapons, like autonomous weapons. So for all these reasons, we should be expecting even faster progress. Not just because of the commercial significance, but because of the political significance. As this philosopher said recently, Vladimir Putin, artificial intelligence is the future. It comes with opportunities and threats. And by the way, whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world. If you think warfare is now done often by cyber warfare or by hacking your enemy's social networks, imagine if this is done in a more intelligent way, how much damage that could do. So many countries don't want to be left behind, and so there's an increasing effort at that level too to invest more. So I've predicted that AI is going to accelerate and disrupt things even more. Just finally, I want to say that AI is only one of 4 dimensions of the fourth industrial revolution. The industrial revolution has gone through itself various waves: steam, electricity, computers, and now I'm going to call it NBIC. Before I talk about NBIC, I just very quickly point out there's an acceleration in timescales between the various waves that historians point out. 120 years between the first 2 waves, only 2/3 of that period between the second and third, only roughly 2/3 of that period between the third and the fourth. There is this acceleration going on as more and more people are working in these fields than ever before. And what's being produced? NBIC. I think this is the right characterization of the fourth industrial revolution. I'm following a few other radical futurists in calling it this. It stands for nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognotech. Infotech's what I've been talking about. It's looking at data and making sense out of it as never before, drawing in conclusions by AI rather than the humans having to put the conclusions in. Nanotech is manipulating atoms more finely than ever before. It's 3D printing. it's quantum computing, it's new sensors, and it's nanobots, which is smaller and smaller computers that can even fit inside the bloodstream. And that takes us on to the third quadrant there, biotech. Increasingly, we're seeing the ability not just to understand our silicon and edit our silicon in our devices. Increasingly, we've got the ability to understand our genes, our epigenome, our biome. Increasingly, we've got the ability to edit that. That's what I see is going to happen big time in the next 5-7 years. The last quadrant is about our brains. Increasingly, we are understanding the brains better than ever before, and cognotech is about enhancing how our neurons work. There are 4 quadrants here. The left is physics, the right is biology, the top is hardware, the bottom is software. But what's really interesting is the interactions between them. We could spend some time exploring that. You know, the better nanotech we've got, the better sensors we've got, the more we can understand what's happening inside somebody's brain without cutting them open. We can sense what's happening when they're being intuitive or when they're meditating, and then we can copy that into our software. So this is my picture for what the next 5 to 7 years hold. It's new kinds of machines, smaller machines, more powerful machines, robots and drones of all sorts, new kinds of algorithms. Not written by humans, but written by AIs. It's new kinds of health, new kinds of life, not just synthetic chemistry, which changed the world in the second industrial revolution. It's synthetic biology. And last but not least, it's the revolution which is least developed of the 4 so far, but it's going to have the biggest impact. It's new kinds of minds, not just the artificial minds, but hybrid minds. Human minds running in a higher processing, higher creativity, higher focus than ever before. This has been driven, as I say, by positive feedback cycles. The first industrial revolution was built with steam-powered tools, which built steam-powered machinery, which built better tools, which built better machinery. Step ahead to the third revolution. Initial computers were very slow to build, but they could be used to help design and manufacture everything, including new computers. Software started off slow and error-prone, but increasingly we can use software to write better software, which means that small teams of people can write much more sophisticated, higher quality software than ever before. And to step forward to the fourth industrial revolution, initially AI was very difficult to write. We needed lots of humans, but now we use AI tools to help us write better AI. A couple of examples. This headline from recently, AI algorithms are starting to teach AI algorithms. The picture suggests AI algorithms are talking to each other. In reality, it means that if you as a human want to learn about AI, you no longer need to find a human to teach you. You can find one of these AI tutors, which is itself an AI to teach you a lot. More significantly, Google's DeepMind have produced something called AutoML, which is able to write machine learning software of its own, which in some instances is more powerful and efficient than the best system the human researchers can design. More and more breakthroughs all the time. So where is this leading? I said there's a variable pace of progress. We often see these things and hear about them, and then nothing seems to happen for a while. It's slow, slow, slow. The internet was talked about for a long time before it turned the newspaper industry upside down. Smartphones were talked about for a long time before it turned the mobile computing, the mobile computing space upside down. But it does come in phases, and when the virtuous cycles get going, my goodness, the change happens, not just in technological capability, but in terms of social impact, which brings me to my final couple of slides. Here's another version of this chart, but this time what I'm tracking is some of the possible social consequences of this technology. And although I've been very positive about all the things it can do for us, many of you are quite worried, frankly, about what it might do in terms of people no longer having meaningful work, people feeling that they're losing their role in life because they're left without the kind of jobs they expected, people feeling that maybe they've got jobs, but they're not getting the increases in salary as they expected. In many parts of the world, the salaries are no longer increasing for the average worker. They're still going up very well for the successful 1%, but more and more people are left behind. And what I'm actually charting here is the ability of people who feel alienated, who feel left behind, who feel disappointed, to do damage as a result of that, whether it's by terrorism, whether it's crazy politics, whether it's getting hold of weapons of mass destruction as a matter of anger and frustration. What I'm showing in the green line is the ability for society to manage society. And so far we're about keeping the lid on people's frustration, but I'm not convinced that's going to continue to be the case. Somewhere, probably between now and 2025, if we're not careful, there's going to be so many angry people around. And I saw in Paris just a few days ago, more and more people saying they're left behind, they're throwing all kinds of things at the police. That's just the start of what might happen. We, as leaders of society, have got more responsibility than ever before to ensure that people feel included. That even though they may not work, there is something valuable for them to do. We have more responsibility to exercise wisdom in terms of showing how everybody can fit into this superabundance which technology might make possible. And to do that, I'll come to my final slide, we need a set of skills which I offer as the most important skills we should be teaching each other, the skills for the leaders of the near future, the skills for our children. Certainly it involves keeping on top of technology trends, trends in human expectation, trends in human behavior, social and political trends. And this is a bit of hard work. We're going to have to figure out which of these technology trends are for real and which of them aren't. And there's not really a shortcut here, apart from collaborating with people who are people you can trust to tell you about that. More and more of us need to be expert in keeping on top of these trends, knowing when a trend is changing from a disappointing phase to a breakthrough phase. The reason I said we are studying these trends is so we can combine them into scenarios, and that requires not just mathematics and logic, it requires imagination, because these future scenarios aren't necessarily just projections of the past. So we need to conceive and evaluate these scenarios in terms of credibility, desirability, and action. And this is hard work. We're not going to do it by ourselves. We're much more likely to be able to do it if we can collaborate, as in here, as in the blue circle, finding people you can share the task with to figure out who are the right partners for these new technologies, where is the community that's on top of this that can help you improve your collective foresight. But even with this collective foresight, there's still going to be many bumps on the road. There's still going to be many things it's hard to make sense out of, which is why I come to the second big dimension of futurism, the ability for us to embrace uncertainty, which means coping with the likelihood that we don't know what we have to do, so we have to experiment and be willing to fail. Not to think, well, we are personally weak because we have failed, but we are learning and becoming smarter as a result, which means we're willing to collect feedback, willing to pivot to some new plan, and to architect for change. These ideas of agility started off in the world of software, small teams. They're important, I believe, for every business now. And many businesses don't like this because they like to be predictable, they like to be in full control, and that's okay for business as usual, but it doesn't work with disruption. To do this is not just a matter of technique, it's a matter of emotional intelligence as well. I think emotional intelligence is much more important in the near future than it's been in the past, in which people are willing to embrace risk and not fear failure. And it also is tied into how quickly we can learn new things, not just by reading ourselves, but by using technology to help us. And if we do this, we'll be able to conceive, but also, I believe, achieve positive scenarios. And how do we know which scenarios are positive or not? It comes back to this question of desirability. It comes back to figuring out what the true values for humanity are. And the question of the true values for humanity, something we've skirted around for a long time. Technology can no longer do that. This is even more important than before. And if we skimp on that, we're likely to end up with a future that sounds initially exciting, but it's going to lead us to this world of exclusion and alienation and frustration and chaos. If we understand this properly, then we can build this new future together. And it will be together. It won't be as individuals. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to a great discussion based on some of these provocations. Thank you.
So that was a great start, David. Thank you very much. And while I fully agree with your view, and even largely with your prediction, just to make it a more full-bodied conversation, let me bring in the view of a small section of economists who are saying that when the automobile came, we felt a lot of jobs of coachmen will go, but automobiles brought more jobs than it took away. Similarly, when the Industrial Revolution came, when the computers came, we thought that more jobs will go, but actually more jobs were given by these new technologies. So let me begin by asking you this question: why do you think the future will be very different from the past?
It's a great question, and indeed, many mainstream consultancies will tell people, you need to train your employees a bit more, but if you train them a bit more, everything will be fine, because indeed there will be more jobs, because that's always been the case in the past. But I have two fundamental objections to that view. First of all, it's the pace of change. And in the past, with the first industrial revolution, it was horrible, but it was spread out over a period of time, and people could indeed, after a while, learn new skills. But the pace of change today is such that if people lose one job and try to retrain to another job, by the time they're retrained, probably that job has been automated as well. And so it's the scale and the pace that puts an even stronger set of pressures on us. But secondly, I think what's going to happen for humans in the fourth industrial revolution is a bit like what happened when automobiles came along, and what happened to horses then. Because before that, horses did all right. You know, when trains came along, it might have been expected that horses would no longer be needed. But actually horses were needed more, because the trains brought more goods and passengers, and then when the people got off the trains, they needed to get on a horse to go wherever they wanted to go. And so for a while, automation caused more jobs for horses. But then eventually the automobile came along and was able to do the job of horses in cities and towns as well. And suddenly the population of horses plummeted, and the salary of a horse went into a fraction of its former self. The horses can no longer be retrained to do something else. Some of them are still used in entertainment, but only a small fraction. Now, what can we humans do when we are displaced? Well, we like to think we have got skills and compassion and creativity and emotional intelligence, but I think AI is increasingly going to do these well too. So even if we have our eye on such a job, we may find that it's nothing like so easy for us. Maybe 1% of people will be able to find good jobs in 2025, 2030, but if we're not careful, 99% of people will feel left out.
So what you're saying is that earlier we kept ourselves ahead in the economic march against machines because we were the only entities which could learn, think, and adapt. Now you are saying that AI, the next technology which is coming, can also learn, think, and adapt, and might be able to beat us at it.
Exactly so. In the first generation of AI, the expert systems could not learn. Everything was put in by humans. Mm-hmm. But now the AIs can learn very fast. Occasionally there are crashes with driverless cars. But guess what? Within a few days, the AIs have figured out how to avoid ever having that same kind of crash again. And when one robot knows how to solve a problem, you know what? All the robots are connected, not the Internet of Things, but the Internet of Robots. So they go much faster than us. If an individual human figures out a better way to drive, it takes a long time for other people to learn how to drive like that too. So their learning is going to, if we're not careful, eclipse us. Now that could be great news, because it means we don't have to work. It means we can now concentrate on what we'd like to do, provided the robots are producing enough goods cheaply enough and high quality enough, which they could do. We just need to be sure that the benefits of that are coming to society as a whole. And that's not a question of technology. That's a question of human values, a question of economics and politics.
So I'm reminded of that story, the boy who cried wolf. And every time he cried, and actually it was a false alarm, the villagers, they became complacent and indifferent to that cry. But then finally the predator arrived and nobody believed him. And I think we are also at a similar cusp where there are still some detractors who do not believe us, but the predator is there.
Yes, so there's no easy answer here. We have to be able to look very carefully at the data and look very carefully at the trends. We have to look at what's slowing down the trend and what might accelerate it. and we're going to need to draw on a lot of people's expertise to make these decisions. But we also have to bear in mind that many people who are offering opinions are motivated. They are motivated in many cases. The consultants from these mainstream companies that I mentioned, they are often motivated to tell the senior managers of companies what they think they would like to hear. And so there is a self-fulfilling prophecy there. So we have to be able to look quite carefully at the advice and use our emotional intelligence to evaluate it, as well as our rational intelligence. It's not easy to know when these breakthroughs will occur. That's why we need a community of people to bring lots of different perspectives so we can start evaluating it wisely.
Another question. When the agriculture got mechanized, 40% of the population was, let us say in US, was engaged in agriculture. All that population, or almost all that population, was no longer employable. So the high school movement came up, and they schooled these people to be ready with numeracy and literacy skills to handle the industrial jobs which will become available. But now, as per your presentation, what you're saying is that earlier one sector which was touched by technology like this was actually the labor which was displaced could be absorbed in another sector. What you are saying is that because of this AI, emotional intelligence, etc., it will be across the board change.
Yes, to be clear, I can't be completely sure that prediction's right, but I think we should take that possibility very seriously, and we should pay attention to the fact that more and more people feel, if not unemployed, then at least underemployed. And I think part of this is to do with technology. It's not all just due to globalization or to a decline in the power of unions. These factors are part of it as well. So I think we can see the trends, and we have to think this is a possible scenario. Are we ready to handle it? Because if we don't think about it early enough, then suddenly we're going to be in a real crisis, and some maverick politician is going to come up and say, I've got a crazy solution which is going to work, and we're all going to give him or her the votes without having thought it through more carefully. So let's work out the solutions objectively and calmly before we get even more into a crisis situation.
So in your experience, or which are your couple of favorite examples of resistance to technology, or let me ask you to tell us about the chloroform example you were telling earlier and the test tube baby example, the resistance to technology, how society resists.
Well, the case of test tube babies is interesting because it shows the change in public attitude. So, and I remember in Britain in the 1970s, and people said, you know, it might be possible for infertile couples to use a new technology called in vitro fertilization, test tube babies, to have extra children. Now, a lot of people from religious backgrounds threw up their hands in horror and said, this is man playing God, it shouldn't be allowed. Some people said, well, you know, if the babies are created in a test tube, they may not have a soul. They were called soulless little devils. The people for the secular background said, well, they probably will be all right from a theological point of view, but they might feel unloved. You know, if they discover their mom and dad made them in a test tube, how terrible they'll feel. So there was a lot of opposition. What did the politicians respond to this? The politicians were quite smart in a sense. They said, well, we don't want to support this because our religious constituencies are against it. And they said, you know what? We are suffering from overpopulation in this world. We shouldn't be putting a lot of resources to helping even more population growth. So they were against it. What about the medical establishment? They actually were against it too, because initially the test tube babies was a terrible experience for the mothers. They went through terrible ups and downs of hormonal imbalances. Even today, when you're on IVF, it's not nice, but it was much worse in the earlier days, and most of it failed. So the few doctors who were doing this were told off by the rest of industry, stop doing this, nobody wants it. And then finally the first baby was born, Louise Brown. And people looked at her and said, you know what, I think she's got a soul. And they looked at the family, and there was so much joy in the family, and they said, actually, maybe we were just a bit too hasty. And very quickly the attitudes changed. And now we don't even bat an eyelid. We hear that Barack and Obama and Michelle Obama, they used IVF to have both of their daughters. And we don't think, oh, how evil. We think that's what technology should be there for. So it is possible for public mood to change. In this case, it was relatively easy because the outcome was attractive and beautiful. Some of the earlier cases some of the cases in the future might have a lot of rough edges on them, and people might rebel against them.
And the chloroform example?
So the chloroform example, we're talking about...
Queen Victoria.
Oh, yes. No, that's a fascinating case, too. So for a long time, it's written in the Old Testament, it's written in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, that because man is sinful, women should feel great pain when they're giving birth, and they should cry out to God, and it's punishment for our sinfulness. And so that's what many people preached. And now in the 1800s, people started discovering by accident anesthetics, such as chloroform. And people realized, you know what, maybe if people who are giving birth have this anesthetic, it will no longer be such a bad experience. And Queen Victoria, who had quite a few children, she heard about it, and after some initial hesitation, she asked her doctor to prescribe it. And her advisor said, no, you should be crying out in pain, Your Majesty, because that's what was prescribed by our religion. But she overruled them, and later she said, oh, blessed chloroform. And nowadays we don't think twice about women having painkillers. We think, of course, we should play God. We should change the state of nature. But there was a big natural resistance to that. So nowadays we've got what we call, at least in Britain, we call the Protestant work ethic, which is if you don't work, you're a substandard person, you don't deserve any welfare, you're a scoundrel. But I think we have to change that attitude too. We have to think, actually, the natural state of humans is no longer to work, especially in a back-breaking situation. The future state of humans is to be creative, to explore. It's to be like permanently retired. You know, we should be able to explore whether it's music or mathematics or art or culture or the universe, rather than having to work. And that should no longer be viewed as a wicked, sinful thing. So I think that attitude is going to take a while to change, because it actually made sense for a long time that we pressurize people to work. That was good. In the future, it's no longer going to be the right case, and we have to alter that attitude too.
And while looking at these technologies, as well as ideas about technologies, we should have more receptive lenses, and these lenses can become more receptive when we look at how we have resisted such ideas before. Coming to universal basic income. What is this universal basic income? Please explain.
So we already have some ideas in society that not everybody needs to work. And when people reach a certain age, we give them a pension even though they're not working. Young people, youngsters, they get some child benefit even though they don't work. When people are ill, most countries in the world have some kind of health care provision for them. So the idea of a universal basic income is to extend that and say, regardless of your status, there's a certain basic sum of money that you should get from the well-being of the whole of society. Society is generating wealth by its corporations, by its technology, by its robots. Some of this should come to everybody without them needing to do anything apart from existing. Hence the universal basic income angle. It's very controversial politically, because if we have to give people today enough money to have a good quality of life, it'll be a lot of money. People wonder how on earth can tax be high enough to cover this. I think it's going to be a struggle to get there, and part of the answer is not going to be to give people more money. Part of the answer is going to be make more and more things cheaper, to make the provisions for education, for healthcare, for food, and for material goods lower and lower cost. That goes against part of our basic culture. Part of our basic culture is to increase the GDP, to increase the value of their economy. In a sense, we're going to be decreasing the value of most of the basics. I think we need to do that, however, move away from measuring our well-being via the proxy of GDP. We should be looking instead at how do we ensure that the basics for a very good life are available as freely as possible.
So some people say that social security net, the detractors, they say social security net is a hammock. Yep. It stifles the drive to succeed. What's your view on that?
So we should look at the data. Mm-hmm. There are some experiments in which people are given a universal basic income without needing to work. Is the evidence that these people become lazy? Actually, the bulk of the evidence shows that it gives them more security in their life. It takes them out of the terror of being in a state of poverty. And in many cases, people in this situation, they start businesses, or they get involved in charitable or philanthropic activity. So these are experiments, some done in Canada. some done indeed in India in various states, which have shown this is an indication, Namibia as well. It's not yet a full experiment because it's only part of society rather than a whole society, but to follow my own recipe. You know, how do we go? We should go agile with this uncertainty. So let's do larger and larger tests of this and see whether people are lazy or not. It's true, if people are in a psychologically disturbed state and they're given money, maybe they will be lazy. But once they've got enough peace of mind and confidence that the money is going to come on a regular basis, they can recover and they can often be stronger. And there's lots of good books on this subject recently. I admire a book written by a young Dutch historian. The book is called Utopia for Realists. He looks at these examples that have been done in different countries, and he makes a plausible case, you know, that it won't make people lazy, it will make people much better.
And Martin Ford says that if you bring in UBI, Universal Basic Income, it can even spur the economy, because when money is concentrated in one hand, for example, Bill Gates' hands, he cannot have 1,000 burgers or 1,000 phones or 1,000 cars, but when it is distributed, it comes into the economy, and that can spur the economy. So it can really favor those industrialists who are many a time opposed to universal basic income.
Yes, so Martin Ford is a Silicon Valley software entrepreneur who has written very interesting books on this, such as The Rise of the Robots. But he's echoing what many right-wing economists have said, not by all means all of them, but Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, both in various ways, spoke in favor of something similar to basic income. They call it a negative income tax, but it also involves distributing money so that the economy doesn't get stuck. Because indeed, if people don't have much money, then it can cause an impediment to the whole economy.
Also, you were saying earlier that universal basic income has spawned geniuses like J.K. Rowling's. What was the point you were making?
So one of the most remarkable authors in recent times is J.K. Rowling, who is the author of Harry Potter. She wrote the Harry Potter book while receiving state subsidy, child income, because she had a child. Somebody may say, well, she's wasting her time with this money. Turns out that she was a creative genius. And there are many others who could be creative geniuses if they weren't in the situation of having to do working in practical situations. Why is Einstein so successful as a genius? Of course he was a genius, but he had the blessing of being able to work in a relatively soft profession, which gave him time to research all the things he researched. There are probably many other people like Einstein who didn't have the chance to be geniuses because they had to work in the farm or in up chimneys or whatever. Once we have a basic income to spread that around, I expect many more creative geniuses.
That's great. So basically you're saying that these people, when they have a little more time on their hands, they can spur invention, which invention also creates necessity. So in some way, invention is also the mother of necessity. That's how Pokemon and other things, even if we don't like them, they command our attention. And you are saying that universal basic income is something we should really consider seriously.
It's part of the transition to a new world.
Okay, because
it can't be done just by telling people to train harder. Consultancies that emphasize that, I think, are actually misguided and irresponsible. We have to look at the political dimensions as well.
No, I'm glad that you bring that perspective, because many a time when a thing is coming from a consultant, we feel that this is the last word. But futurists like you or professionals like you who have studied the issue thoroughly and who have the character and the competence to present it in a way which is compelling. That's great. Coming to machine sensitivity. Suppose a robot is told that make human beings smile. It can think, okay, a shorter way or to do that is to just put 2 electrodes in the man's cheek, and he will be forever smiling. So let's just call it the Midas fallacy. The king who did not realize that the objective which he is stating is not actually aligned with what he wants. So how will we make sure that artificial intelligence does not misread any of our wishes and actually punishes us just because we have not been able to frame it properly?
So this is the point I was trying to make at the very end, which is the importance of understanding human values more fully than before. If we have a kind of a naive or simplistic understanding of human values, a slogan, and we feed that slogan into our AI, we might realize after it's carrying it out, oh, hang on, it's more complicated than that. But if the AI is very powerful and very successful, it might be implementing something which is difficult for us then to stop. You mentioned the old Greek fable of King Midas. Of course, he wanted wealth, and he said, well, give me wealth, anything I touch should turn to gold. He didn't mean it literally, but then he touched his food and it turned to gold, and he touched his daughter and she turned to gold. Now, no software engineer, AI designer is going to do anything as stupid as that, but they might do something similar but more subtle or a more complicated. And after all, there are many stories of the genie who gives you 3 wishes, and the person, usually by the 3rd wish, wishes to undo the previous 2 because they haven't thought through the consequences. So if we take human powers and magnify them in the way that AI might do, we might realize that some of the human virtues, which are virtuous in small scale, are no longer virtuous in the very large scale. We're going to have to think much harder about this than before. So that's what I want more people to do, thinking on the actual deeper understanding of human values.
And what do you think should be our outlook to education now, given this change which is coming? Are there certain subjects which should get primacy, certain skills which we should be focusing more towards?
So in some ways, my answer was on the last slide. It is we need to be able to learn how to learn, because whatever we've learned is probably going to be superseded by the time we're in the workforce. So learning how to learn, we need to learn emotional intelligence so that we don't mind having to reconfigure ourselves and change ourselves. We need the collaborative skills so that even if we can't figure it out by ourselves, we can work out who are the reliable people we can trust, who can help us to figure it out. And we need both skills of research, because we're going to have to learn a lot, but also the skills of imagination to figure out what this research might mean. Now, of course, there has to be specialist subjects too, and for the short term, there's certainly careers to be had in each of the 4 quadrants of my chart. So there's certainly work to be had in artificial intelligence or deep learning for the next 10 years or so. There's work to be had in nanotechnology. There's work to be had in genetic engineering and new healthcare solutions, rejuvenation biotechnology, and there's work to be had in understanding the flow and the consciousness and higher states of consciousness. But regardless of which area you work in, there are these so-called soft skills which are even more important than in the past.
So I was speaking in reference to research which Avinash Meetu has done. He has found that on LinkedIn, the skills which managers are looking for in the new hires are software development 35%, IT infra 25%, big data and analytics 15%, digital marketing 15%. So he says 80% of all the skills which employers are today looking for are computational skills. So what's your view on STEM, or should we add certain things to STEM? And what is STEM?
So there is a common view that says the most important thing to teach your children is how to code. If you teach your children to code, you'll guarantee them a job in the future. I don't think that's true, because in the future more and more coding is going to be done by software itself rather than by humans. I still think it's good to teach people how to code, because it teaches people a certain abstract skills and awareness, which is useful. So when I went to school, I had to learn Latin because it taught you how to think abstractly, and then I changed to do computer science, which was a good move on my part. Not just because it helped me to think abstractly, but I actually got a job in software engineering. So don't study computing just because you think you'll be sure of getting a job in computing, but be ready to change whatever skill you're in. It's a difference between what people are looking for now and what people might be looking for in 5 to 7 years' time.
Some people are of the view that earlier education was like a house you were constructing
Yes.
with deep foundations. And now it should be like a foldable tent, so that you learn, and in the next 10 years, you will have to learn again, so you carry your tent to the next destination, because things will keep on changing.
Yes.
You agree with that?
Yes, so the old model was you spent time learning, then you spent time earning, and then you retired. But the future is going to be all mixed up. You know, we're going to continue learning and earning in parallel. And by the way, we'll be semi-retired most of the time as well. So instead of working 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, it'll be probably 2 or 3 days a week instead.
Great. So I have many more questions from you, but now, like a liberal moderator, I will open the house to questions from the audience. Though there are many hands going up, okay. Let's start with Prabal. Prabal, I'm coming to you. After that, Rajiv and Jaggi.
Start.
Okay, Rajiv.
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is, in the fourth industrial revolution, do you see any lag between developing countries and developed countries, if any? So in certain pockets, we know it will happen almost at the same time. But I'm sure you know India. So let's say you see the immediate impact will happen in India too, like any Western market, or you see lag, and why?
So there's less of a lag than before. And China is the particularly clear case. China is already producing more articles, research articles on deep learning than America. Now you can say maybe there are more copycat articles, maybe there's more quantity and less quality, but I'm not convinced that's even the case. So China has shown that with enough industrial strategy from the government, whether it's local government or national government, they can be a leader. So I'm sure there are parts of India, whether it's India as a whole or parts of India, that can be world leaders in some of this fourth industrial revolution.
Okay, Prabal. I'm coming to you, General Saab. I'm coming to you, Air Marshal.
I think, first of all, it was an outstanding conversation between the two of you. So David, a little bit confusing. I think we are developing technologies to make ourselves redundant. And I think you emphasized a lot about human existence, okay, that we just need to exist. Because most of the things are going to be done by either robots or artificial intelligence. So the question that comes up is that, what is the purpose of that existence? Where do you see that moving? So do you believe that the human society is going to now gradually move towards, will become more spiritual? Because there has to be a reason for our existence.
Yes, so our reason for existence has never been so that we work. We always worked in order to make some money for something else. And whether it was to enjoy time with our families, it was to enjoy our hobbies occasionally, enjoy our vacations. And of course, we did enjoy our work too, if we were lucky enough to get a job that we somehow matched our own values. So maybe in the future, we'll do some things still without being paid for them. When I like golf, I play golf from time to time, even though I know many people are much better than me in golf, but I still enjoy it, even though I know many people are much better, and surely the robots in the future will outperform me at golf too. That doesn't matter. So we will make up our own mind what we exist for, but I think it's for creativity and exploration, and as you said, it's a more spiritual thing. It's about relationships, it's about self-development. People in the past who were fortunate enough not to need to work, whether they were the aristocrats, they didn't get bored on the whole. They managed to enjoy themselves doing scientific research or music or arts or exploring. I think everybody in various ways will find out what they want to do and explore. And there might be whole new things that we hardly conceive of today, which once society frees us from the burden of unpleasant work, we will discover and explore in more depth.
Great. Jaggi.
David, even as we speak, right now the city of Paris has been brought to its knees by protesters, and they are protesting about issues which go back to the 50s actually, in terms of basic needs in Paris. Do you feel this is actually an ethical debate also, that artificial intelligence is basically a corporate or an industrial need vis-a-vis a need of masses of people? Just to give an example, like you must have read about this Chinese doctor who has, this perfect genetic babies which have come out. Now, what is the need for that? So in that context, if you can give me an answer.
So I'm very much in favor of putting these high-tech companies under a wise democratic control, because you're quite right. They may do things which make sense from them from an economic point of view and short-term revenues, but wouldn't be the right decision for society. Many of the things that social media have been doing recently have got very detrimental outcomes. Maybe some of the pharmaceutical companies are doing medical treatments which make them a lot of money, but don't actually help the poor patients as much as they could get from cheaper, but maybe more less glossy mechanisms. So we should put these companies under wise democratic control, but that, of course, is hard because our democracies are not very well functioning either in many cases. That's why we need to have a groundswell of popular, wise discussion and gradually raise up. In terms of genetic editing, I am a fan of genetic editing. I think if people grow up with a susceptibility to HIV like these babies might have done, then they're better off not having that susceptibility. I think there's many parts of our human nature which we have by natural state, which actually isn't very good. And if we can use technology to free us from these damages, we'll be able to flourish more. But again, it has to be done wisely, and not just because we can. There has to be a very important ethical debate. Ethics means, yes, we could do this, but we're not going to do it because we have some higher principle involved. So let's have these discussions about what's the right principles or not. Let's not be like the doctors who opposed the mothers having painkillers during childbirth because they thought they knew best. Let's free ourselves from some of these older thinking. Let's understand what's actually the valuable things in our ethical systems which must be upheld fully.
Janil Khurana.
Thank you, David, for a very illuminating talk. My question, you partly touched on it already, but I want to take it.
Can you just bring your...
Yeah, sorry. My question, you partly touched on it already, but you've touched on social and emotional aspects. But as I look around, the pace of change being what, as you very rightly said, is going to be so fast, we're looking at 2025, which is 6 years from today. There are, the globe is becoming very volatile. There are conflicts, there are gaps, and with this speed, with this kind of technology coming, the gaps between various countries, various cultures, various economic levels is going to become much bigger. Now, all your talk was based on technology impacting on organizations, on communities. But if I was to add on to it what may happen at the global level, the conflicts which may come, do you see a world, do you see a globe in the next 5 to 10 years which may so impact the growth of technology that this path that you've shown us may get breached somewhere?
So when I look in my non-existent crystal ball, which gives me lots of different possible scenarios for the future, some of them are indeed very good, many of them are actually very bad. And which scenario comes about is still in our hands. So although I talked about positive uses of technology in most of my talk, it's true that the same technologies could do very destructive things. We haven't touched on global warming yet, but that is getting worse. It's getting worse faster than we're able to fix it using green technology. So global warming is one problem. There is the problem of genetic editing of pathogens. Why would anybody do that? Well, maybe they're angry enough and they hate the world enough, they're really bitter about life. They think, I'm going to unleash this virus. Imagine the Novichok virus, which caused damage to a few individuals in England recently. Imagine if that had been put into the water supply. So there are risks from angry people, angrier maybe than the bulk of those in Paris. They're quite angry, but they're not going to do anything quite as mad as that. But there are some people who get really suicidal. What do they do when they're really suicidal? One German pilot put his airplane right in the middle of a mountain. He hated the world so much. Some of the people who sign up to some extreme religious viewpoint, Islamic State or not, and they think somehow their religion teaches them it's all right to cause even worse scale damage. So technologies, whether it's this global warming, whether it's pathogens, whether it's nuclear weapons, which thankfully we haven't had a nuclear war, but we've come close to it a few times, and if we're not careful, especially when cyber systems attack each other, then they might imagine there's a nuclear war breaking out and they might respond in a bad way. So I see plenty of reasons to be fearful. I say about 35% probability of a new dark age by, say, about 2040. I see a 60% chance of the much better future, which is the sustainable abundance, because I do think, on the whole, humans are largely very positive people, and even though sometimes we say crazy things and do crazy things, at heart there's lots of goodness in all of us. But I don't take it for granted, and 35% chance of a bad future is far, far too worrying for me, which is why we need to have this discussion much more urgently. This is not just a discussion about how can my company make more money in the next few quarters. This is a discussion about how can we have an environment in which it's worth having anything in the future rather than going backwards into potentially a new dark age or worse.
And General Saab, to add to what David has said, I see where this question is coming from. It is coming from your geopolitic as well as corporate background, and at the bottom of xenophobia or protectionism or extremism is inequality. So, in fact, David has done a lot of work in this, and I request all of you to please hear his videos, and you will see what a very, very well reasoned and high caliber of conversation which he is having on this. Air Marshal Inamdar. Mike, please, here. Here, first table, here, front.
Thank you, Pawan. Thank you very much. I must compliment Mr. Wood and both you putting across something very, very complex to my mind so lucidly and so beautifully. Thank you very much. Great takeaways from it. Thank you. In a discussion like this, or in a crowd like this, I feel very out of place. For the simple reason, I find myself a wrong man in the right crowd. Having spent 42 years, I'm a military man, as the name would suggest. Having spent 42 years of my life just zooming around in the blue yonder at twice the speed of sound in fighter jets, I find this intellectual discourse, narrative dialogue, a bit beyond my ken, but try my best. I'm doing exactly that today. I went to the white paper that came out with this. And when I go to the white paper, I find that the three pillars of this discussion today, one was the mindset, second was the structures, third was the economic viability. I went through them very carefully, and I find that the most unsettling, or the most amazing distillate of these three pillars is a whopping 54% of the manpower being used today having to be reskilled and converted to cope with the AI introduction or induction in just 6 years from today, maybe less than 6 years, 1925. Given the recent and present and likely future rate and numbers of reskilling involved and achieved the world over, and especially in developing economies like India, what do you think are the chances of these countries and India being ready to introduce this change, be abreast of it, if not a step ahead?
It's a great question. So if we keep going at the present rate of management of change, it's going to be far too slow. Society will be left behind by these changes unless we can find ways to have a better discussion, a faster discussion, and more effective discussion. So that's why the political dimension, the broad political dimension, is so important to progress this. Sometimes legislation takes a very long time to go through the courts and the parliaments. That's sort of sensible because we shouldn't rush into things, but we do need to be able to go faster. And maybe AI can help us on this, So AI can help to draft and to review the drafts and can make recommendations. And then more people can review it. And the humans will be more quickly able to say, you know what, this is the right regulations, this is the right system. But unless we have the ability to change more quickly with this agile mechanisms that I spoke about, then the pace of change is going to cause grief. Big grief.
So, yeah, go ahead, please, sir.
David, first of all, thank you very much for a very impressive presentation, and Pawan, great discussion. If you were to be advising the political leaders, and given that there's going to be so much of a complex change in the society, there are going to be these youngsters looking for jobs and don't know whether they're going to have that job tomorrow or not. You're going to have the companies sort of looking at a different perspective, whether it's innovation or you talk about collaboration, sharing of information. On the political governance, what would your advice be to the political leaders? Top 3.
So they must do more experiments with something similar to UBI or a social contract. Sadly, many governments around the world who say they're going to do these experiments, they get distracted by short-term issues. It's a bit like companies who know they should be doing innovation, but there's always a fire burning which takes their management effort away, and then they get left behind. So they have to carve off some parts of the political thinking to look at these new social models, and new social contracts such as a UBI. And maybe this can be helped by appointing a minister for the future, or a minister for artificial intelligence, or a minister for the 4th Industrial Revolution. That would be part of it.
I hope the think tank heads here, as well as the esteemed politicians or people in public life sitting here, are making note of the point which you made. Go ahead, David.
So that's the first thing I'd put. Secondly, they have to find ways, the politicians have to find more reliable ways to keep up to date with what technology is enabling. I sometimes listen to politicians, and often I'm depressed at their misunderstanding, but it's not all the way. So I don't actually know what Indian politicians have been saying about this, so I'll exclude them. But I've heard some South Korean politicians talking about the growth of AI, and it's been very impressive. So there are some politicians who do understand the nature of the changes ahead. And so each political grouping has got to ensure they have tapping into the right community that's on top of this. And third, to follow my own advice on collaboration, each political group shouldn't be trying to work out all the answers by themselves in their own country. They should be looking around the world to see what they can learn from elsewhere. And it might mean learning a little bit from South Korea here, learning a little bit from Dubai here, learning a bit from some Indian group there, a group in India somewhere. So let's build that network. And some politicians are doing it. In the British Parliament, there are some members of Parliament who are on fact-finding tours that include Korea and China and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and a few others that I forget. So they are starting along these lines.
And David, I have my points to
There's
contain.
a question over here.
Yeah, just coming. I have my points to contend with our Prime Minister,
Yeah.
but he is also very well aware of the new technology. You should sometime hear what he has spoken on blockchain, etc. We have a question here, Ronesh, and then I'm coming to you, Sonu. Okay, you've got the mic.
I've got the mic, sorry, Ronesh.
Ronesh. Okay.
David, you said about 3 questions ago, using the crystal ball that you don't have, that you're worried about the 35% rogue humans who will use AI to wreak havoc. What about rogue machines themselves? Because no matter what science fiction movie we see or a science fiction serial, the world, 50 years from now is not a very, it's a dangerous place, and it's not so much because of the humans, but because of the machines. So what is your view on that, please?
Yes. So in my 35% of scenarios in which there are bad outcomes, some of them are caused by humans getting too much power and doing bad things with it. It's just a small minority, but that can be enough. Some of them are indeed caused by machines doing unintentional things with bugs in them. So we do have this software that goes wrong from time to time, either because of bad programming or because they've been wrongly specified. Somebody has done the equivalent of saying, make humans happy, and it comes along and puts electrodes into all of us and makes us smile the whole day long. We might be smiling, but we realize actually, oh, this wasn't what we intended. So some of these scenarios are misleading, but some of them are real. The best book on this is by an Oxford professor called Nick Bostrom. His book is called Superintelligence. It's quite a difficult book, but if you work hard at it, you can read it. A slightly more accessible book is by a professor from MIT. It's called Life 3.0. And he looks at, I think it's called Staying Human in the Age of Machines or something like that. His name is Max Tegmark. He's actually a physicist, but he writes very well about these matters of AI. And he makes it clear that there are problems of machines going wrong. They're not the same problems as Hollywood tends to project, but there's similar underlying issues. And absolutely, we do need to pay attention to it.
Okay. Ronesh, last two questions, Ronesh. And then Sanjay Banerjee. Both of them are coming from the headhunting sector. Go ahead,
Headhunting.
please. Ronesh.
Yeah, David, first of all, excellent presentation. Must compliment you for that. My question is twofold. Number one, looking across to the next 7 years or 10 years, what sort of jobs do you think will become redundant? And which will be the first ones that will become redundant? Number two is, do you see a scenario when organizations will be run by robots as they're getting more and more smarter than human beings?
So some robots are able to do some management tasks already, because a lot of people are managed by project management systems, and so there are some AIs that can now run some of these project management systems. So it's not yet making the goals, but once the project has been set up, all the reporting can be done by some AI. So they're starting along the way, but there's still many other things managers do, which for the short term at least AIs can't do. The jobs that are most likely to be redundant are the ones in which humans are behaving like robots already. In other words, they're doing the same thing again and again. They're repeating and repeating, and it might be complicated things they're repeating, but if it can be repeated, then the robots can come along and do the job more reliably without breaking down. So the jobs that are most likely to be made redundant are the ones that are most like robotic already. But increasingly, even the jobs with creativity and care and compassion are likely to be changed, slightly longer term. If you look at a job like a doctor, many things that a doctor do could be done by an AI already in terms of understanding all the different possible diseases. There's something like 10,000 different diseases and 10,000 different drug combinations you could use. How can a doctor keep on top of all of that? An AI could do that much better. In terms of reassuring the patient and putting their arm on the shoulder and saying, you'll be fine, trust me, maybe that's a bit harder, but we'll have the compassionate artificial intelligence doing that in due course too. So I go with the prediction that one of the Americans' leading venture capitalists, Vinod Khosla, made a while back, that by 2025, 80% of what doctors currently do will be done better by AIs. Not that they'll all be out of jobs, of course. So there still will be doctors, but they'll be doing things differently.
Sanjay.
Okay. David, you did mention in terms of skill sets required for moving forward in, say, 2025, clearly you need to obviously learn how to learn, have certain number of softer skills that you need to acquire. My question is related to specifically for somebody getting into the workspace 7 years, say by 2025 in the technology sector. From what I could gather from your slide was essentially it's good to have not only the mathematical and technical and coding skills, also probably certain level of technical understanding of biology. You know, I'm coming from the 4 quadrants that you drew, is something which could be critical to be a skilled employee in this sector. Is that correct?
It's certainly true that people who have software skills may find new opportunities in the healthcare and biological space. So the professor in Cambridge who works at Microsoft Research, Krish Bishop, said recently he thinks that Microsoft could cure the problems of cancer within 10 years by using software methods and blood testing. By that he meant that they're going to treat the problems of cancer in the same way that you approach a software problem. And so there is certainly skills and opportunities there. On the other hand, it's not just sufficient to do STEM. I didn't quite answer your question on this. I missed that out. STEM means science, technology, engineering, and maths. Everybody, I think, needs some literacy in that. But absolutely, we need the soft skills as well. So people talk about STEAM, S-T-A-M, where A stands at least for arts. It means a broader sensitivity to matters of imagination and matters of evaluation. How do you figure out whether something's good or bad? Not just because it computes, but because in some sense it enhances human flourishing. So I think everybody needs this broader understanding. I'd also educate people more in history as well. Sounds like a lot, but unless we have good knowledge of the past, we're likely to have a very naive knowledge of what may happen in the future. I think we can get better foresight by having better hindsight, which is one of the reasons I gave a couple of examples of the past at the beginning. So I would not want to hire somebody who was just STEM through and through. I would want to hire people who had these skills, but others as well.
So great. I think we will have time for you to, the rest of you to interact with David one-on-one. Let me close this discussion. And since I'm already in a future space, I wish you a happy weekend. Hey, Siddharth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wood and Mr. Chaudhary. It was indeed a highly thought-provoking and eye-opening and hopefully an action-provoking session. And thank you very much for your kind participation. If you wish to know more about the topic and you wish to connect with Mr. Wood, he'll be happy to engage with you. While several of you are already members of the Blue Circle, those of you who would like to be part of our gatherings next year, kindly reach out to me. Also, as a small token of our appreciation, I would like to hand over these gifts to our speakers. Thank you very much, and please join us for some wine and snacks, please. Thank you.